"Mom, it's time to stop pretending this house still belongs to you," my son said as calmly as if he were discussing the weather, and somehow that hurt more than if he had shouted. The chandelier above the dining table cast a soft golden glow across the room Harold and I had spent 38 years building together. Every holiday dinner had happened in this room. Every birthday candle. Every whispered apology after family arguments. Yet that night, sitting at the end of the long mahogany table, I suddenly felt like a guest in my own life. Heather adjusted the sleeve of her cream-colored sweater and slid a stack of papers across the polished wood toward me. Her nails were freshly done, pale pink, elegant, controlled. "We're only trying to make things easier for everyone, Evelyn," she said with that careful voice she used whenever she wanted to sound compassionate. "Easier for everyone." I stared down at the papers without touching them. Property evaluations, estate planning notes, suggested timelines. They had already divided my future into folders and signatures. Daniel leaned back in Harold's chair, my husband's chair. He'd started sitting there after the funeral as though grief itself had transferred ownership. "The upkeep on this place is too much now," he continued. "The taxes alone are almost $11,000 a year. You shouldn't have to deal with all that at your age." At your age? Funny how those words appear once people begin calculating what remains after you're gone. I folded my hands carefully in my lap to stop them from trembling. Outside, rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows, and somewhere upstairs the old grandfather clock chimed 8 times. Olivia sat near the corner of the table scrolling quietly on her phone. My granddaughter barely looked up. She was 19 now. Beautiful. Detached. Heather reached for her wine glass and smiled faintly. "There's a wonderful senior living community near Scottsdale. Private cottages. Golf. Activities. Women your age absolutely love it there. Women your age." I noticed how they never used words like mother or grandmother anymore. Only categories. Only limitations. I looked around the dining room. Slowly, the silver-framed family photographs. Harold's favorite painting near the staircase. The tiny crack in the ceiling crown molding he'd promised to repair every summer for 20 years. This house still carried his laugh in the walls. I could hear it sometimes when everything was quiet enough. "We already spoke with a realtor," Heather added carefully, "just to explore options." Of course they had. Daniel finally met my eyes then, though only briefly. "It's not personal, Mom. We're trying to think long-term." Long-term. An interesting phrase to use with a 72-year-old widow. I nodded once, slowly, as though I were considering everything reasonably. That seemed to relax them. Heather even smiled with relief, mistaking my silence for surrender. But silence is a dangerous thing. People mistake it for weakness because they cannot hear the calculations happening underneath it. I picked up the top sheet of paper at last. My own home reduced to market projections and renovation estimates. Someone had already highlighted the value of Harold's antique study collection in yellow marker. "You should really sign before winter," Heather said softly. "The market's strong right now." I looked directly at her for the first time all evening. Her expression remained perfectly composed, but beneath it I saw impatience. Hunger. The kind that grows quietly inside people long before anyone notices. Then Daniel said the sentence that changed something permanently inside me. "Dad would have wanted us to move forward." I felt the air leave my lungs so slowly it almost resembled peace. Harold Whitmore had spent his entire life protecting this family. Protecting me. And suddenly, I understood something sitting there beneath the chandelier, while rain touched the windows of the house he built with his bare hands. They thought grief had made me fragile. They thought loneliness had made me blind. What they didn't know was that Harold had seen all of this coming long before I ever did. The house sounded different after Harold died. I noticed it most in the mornings. For 38 years, I had woken to the sound of his slippers crossing the hardwood floors before sunrise, followed by the quiet whistle he always made while brewing coffee in the kitchen. Now the mornings felt hollow. The silence stretched through every hallway like fog. 3 weeks after the funeral, I walked downstairs at 6:30 expecting the familiar smell of dark roast coffee, only to find Heather standing in my kitchen wearing silk workout clothes and reorganizing my cabinets without asking. She smiled brightly when she saw me. "Oh good, you are awake. I was just trying to make things more efficient in here." Efficient. Another word people use when they are slowly removing traces of your life. I stood there in my robe watching her stack my dishes into neat piles as though she had already lived there for years. Harold had bought those blue ceramic plates during our anniversary trip to Vermont back in 1994. He carried every box himself because he was afraid the delivery company would break them. Heather did not know that. She did not care to know it. Daniel came downstairs 20 minutes later dressed for work, loosening his tie while scrolling through emails on his phone. "Morning, Mom," he said absent-mindedly before opening the refrigerator. No kiss on the cheek. No pause to ask whether I had slept well. Just routine politeness. I realized then how quickly grief changes shape inside a family. At first, everyone gathers around the widow. They bring casseroles and flowers and sympathy cards. Then one morning the casseroles stop coming, the flowers die, and suddenly people begin speaking around you instead of to you. By the second month after Harold's funeral, I no longer recognized the rhythm of my own home. Heather started scheduling contractors without consulting me. New landscaping plans appeared on the kitchen counter beside the mail. One afternoon I returned from my doctor appointment and found two men measuring the living room windows for replacement curtains. "The house needs brighter colors," Heather explained casually. "It feels a little outdated." Outdated. As though 38 years of marriage were a decorating style people had grown tired of. Even Olivia changed. She used to sit with me for hours when she was younger listening to stories about Harold's years in the Navy or our road trips through Colorado in the old station wagon. Now she barely looked up from her phone during dinner. Sometimes I caught her watching Heather carefully before speaking, as though she had learned there were consequences for choosing the wrong side. The strangest part was how organized everything became after Harold died. Too organized. Heather handled the utility bills before I could even open them. Daniel suddenly insisted on reviewing my medications. They started discussing my future while pretending I was included in the conversation. "It is probably safer if Mom does not drive at night anymore," Heather said one evening while passing the mashed potatoes. "The roads around here are getting dangerous." I looked at Daniel, waiting for him to laugh it off. Instead, he nodded slowly. "Maybe Heather is right. Maybe Heather is right." Those 4 words became the soundtrack of my widowhood. I heard them every time another piece of my independence quietly disappeared. Then one rainy afternoon, while looking for Harold's watch in the upstairs hallway closet, I noticed something missing. The cedar box where he kept our original mortgage papers and military documents was gone. I stood frozen beside the closet shelf, staring at the empty space where it had sat untouched for decades. When I asked Heather about it later that evening, she did not even blink. "Oh, I moved some old paperwork into storage," she said smoothly. "There was just too much clutter upstairs." Clutter. I smiled politely and nodded as though I believed her. But that night, lying awake beneath the cold half of Harold's bed, I realized something that would not let me sleep. They were not simply preparing the house for a new future. They were preparing it for a future without me in it. The first thing they removed was Harold's photograph from the front hallway. I noticed it on a Thursday afternoon after returning from the grocery store. For 38 years, that framed picture had sat on the narrow oak table beside the staircase. Harold wearing his gray suit at Daniel's college graduation, smiling with one hand resting proudly on our son's shoulder. Every person who entered the house saw that photograph first. But that afternoon, the table stood empty except for a scented candle Heather had placed there beside a bowl of decorative stones. I stood in the hallway holding 2 grocery bags while rainwater dripped softly from my coat onto the hardwood floor. "Where is your father's picture?" I asked quietly when Daniel walked past me toward the kitchen. He barely slowed down. "Heather thought the entryway needed a cleaner look," he said. Cleaner. As though Harold's face had become clutter too. That night, I went upstairs and searched every closet until I finally found the photograph wrapped in newspaper inside a storage box in the garage beside old Christmas decorations and unused paint cans. I sat there for nearly 10 minutes staring at Harold's smile under the dim overhead light while the garage door rattled softly in the wind. Something about seeing him buried beneath forgotten household junk unsettled me more deeply than I wanted to admit. After that, I began noticing other changes. Small things at first. My favorite reading chair disappeared from the den one weekend while I was visiting my sister in Tucson. Heather explained that she had donated it because the fabric looked worn. The antique clock Harold restored by hand vanished from the fireplace mantel 3 days later. "It is in storage," she assured me with a polite smile. "We are trying to modernize the space a little." We. That word followed me everywhere now. We decided. We thought. We planned. I had become an outsider listening to strangers redesign my own life. One Sunday morning, I opened my bedroom door and nearly stopped breathing. Two movers stood in the hallway carrying boxes out of Harold's study. "Careful with those," Heather instructed while sipping coffee downstairs. "Most of it is probably outdated paperwork anyway." I walked down the staircase slowly, gripping the railing harder with each step. "What exactly is happening?" I asked. Heather looked up from her phone without the slightest embarrassment. "Oh good, you are awake. We are converting the study into a guest suite." Guest suite. Harold's study still smelled faintly like his cedar, aftershave, and old leather-bound books. His reading glasses remained folded beside the desk lamp exactly where he left them before his heart attack 6 months earlier. Daniel appeared behind her, tightening the cuffs of his dress shirt. "Mom, nobody uses that room anymore," he said carefully. "We thought the space could be more practical." Practical. Another funeral word for memory. I looked from my son to my daughter-in-law and realized neither of them seemed cruel in their own minds. That was the frightening part. They spoke with the calm confidence of people who believed they were being reasonable, efficient, forward-thinking, compassionate. Heather even reached over and squeezed my hand gently. "You deserve a fresh start too, Evelyn." Fresh start. As if widowhood were some retirement package waiting to be enjoyed. That evening I went upstairs after dinner and found the lock on Harold's study already changed. I stood alone in the hallway staring at the polished brass handle while muffled laughter drifted upward from the kitchen below. For the first time since Harold died, anger moved quietly through me beneath the grief. Not loud anger. Not dramatic anger. Something colder. More awake. Then, just as I turned away from the locked door, I heard Heather's voice float up from downstairs. "Once the paperwork is finalized, we can finally move ahead with the renovation." And Daniel answered with a sentence that made my blood run cold. "We just need Mom out of the way first." I stood outside Harold's locked study for nearly an hour after hearing Daniel's voice downstairs. The hallway lamp cast a weak yellow light across the carpet, and the entire second floor smelled faintly of fresh paint from the renovations Heather had already started planning. "We just need Mom out of the way first." I repeated those words silently while staring at the brass doorknob that no longer opened for me. Somewhere below, dishes clinked softly in the kitchen, and Heather laughed at something Olivia said. Ordinary sounds. Comfortable sounds. That was what unsettled me most. Life inside the house continued so easily, while mine seemed to be quietly erased room by room. I finally walked downstairs with the same calm expression I had worn since Harold's funeral. Heather looked up from the kitchen island where she sat reviewing fabric samples spread neatly beside her laptop. "There you are," she said brightly. "I was just showing Olivia some ideas for the downstairs remodel." Remodel. They spoke about transforming the house the way younger couples talk about buying a vacation condo or replacing patio furniture. Daniel loosened his tie and avoided looking directly at me while pouring himself another glass of sparkling water. "Mom, there is leftover chicken in the refrigerator if you are hungry." Leftovers. Once, this kitchen had been the center of our family. Harold carving turkey every Thanksgiving while football played softly in the living room. Daniel sneaking rolls before dinner when he thought I was not watching. Olivia baking sugar cookies with me at Christmas while powdered sugar covered the countertops. Now I felt like someone visiting a museum built from my own memories. "I am not hungry," I said quietly. Heather smiled without warmth. "You really should eat more regularly, Evelyn. At our age, nutrition becomes very important." Our age. She was 46 years old. I almost admired the confidence it took to place herself beside me, as though we belonged to the same generation. I turned toward the staircase, but stopped when I heard Heather speak again, softer this time. "Did you call the retirement community today?" Silence followed. Then Daniel answered carefully. "Not yet. Retirement community." The words settled over the room heavier than I expected. Heather lowered her voice further, though not enough. "We cannot keep delaying this. The market is strong right now, and the contractor said renovations should start before January." I continued standing there with one hand resting lightly on the banister. Neither of them noticed I had paused, or perhaps they no longer cared whether I heard them. "She is still grieving," Daniel muttered. "Exactly," Heather replied smoothly. "That is why this is the best time. Once she settles somewhere comfortable, everything will be easier for everyone." Comfortable. People always use gentle words when discussing uncomfortable things. I walked upstairs slowly afterward, and closed my bedroom door without making a sound. Rain tapped against the windows again, steady and cold. Harold used to say Arizona storms sounded softer than storms anywhere else in the country. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at his empty pillow beside mine until my eyes drifted toward the old cedar chest near the closet. Harold kept important documents there for years before moving most of them into his study. Slowly, almost without thinking, I crossed the room and opened it. Inside were photo albums, insurance records, old birthday cards, and one navy blue envelope tucked beneath a folded army blanket. My name appeared across the front in Harold's handwriting. Evelyn. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a single note dated almost 2 years earlier. If you are reading this, sweetheart, then certain people have started showing you who they really are. Do not panic. Call Samuel Bennett before you sign anything. He already knows everything. I stared at the page while thunder rolled faintly in the distance beyond the windows. Then, for the first time since Harold died, I smiled. The next morning I waited until Daniel and Heather left the house before calling Samuel Bennett. My hands remained steady while dialing the number, which surprised me. For weeks I had felt like a ghost drifting silently through rooms that no longer belonged to me. But Harold's letter had changed something overnight. Grief still sat heavy in my chest, but now it rested beside clarity. Samuel answered on the second ring. His voice sounded older than I remembered, rougher around the edges. Evelyn, he said quietly after I introduced myself. I was wondering when you would call. I sat alone at the kitchen table while early sunlight spilled across the marble countertops Heather planned to replace. You knew? I asked softly. Samuel sighed. Harold asked me to prepare for this possibility almost 3 years ago. 3 years. Long before hospitals. Long before funerals. Long before Daniel stopped looking at me like his mother. I closed my eyes briefly and pictured Harold sitting in his study late at night reviewing paperwork while pretending to watch old baseball games. He did not trust them? I whispered. He trusted love, Samuel replied carefully. But he also understood what money can do to people once patience disappears. The silence between us stretched for several seconds. Finally, Samuel asked me to meet him downtown at his office that afternoon. Bring the letter with you, he said. And Evelyn, do not sign anything they put in front of you. I drove into Phoenix just after lunch beneath a pale gray sky. Harold and I had visited Samuel's office dozens of times over the years for business paperwork and estate planning updates, but walking into the building alone felt strangely unfamiliar. Samuel greeted me personally in the lobby. He looked thinner now, his silver hair almost completely white, but his eyes remained sharp. He guided me quietly into his office overlooking downtown traffic and closed the door behind us. For several moments, he simply studied me with visible sadness. You look exactly like your husband did whenever he realized he was right about something unfortunate, he said gently. Despite everything, I laughed softly at that. Samuel opened a locked drawer in his desk and removed a thick folder marked Whitmore Family Trust. My stomach tightened immediately. Harold revised everything after Daniel and Heather moved into the house, he explained. He noticed changes before you did. Changes. I thought about the cold politeness. The endless discussions about property taxes. The careful suggestions about assisted living communities disguised as concern. Samuel slid several documents across the desk toward me. Your husband created protective clauses connected to inheritance distribution, he continued. Specific behavioral conditions. I frowned slightly. Behavioral conditions? Samuel nodded once. Anyone attempting to pressure you out of your residence, manipulate financial decisions, isolate you emotionally, or interfere with your legal independence automatically forfeits their inheritance rights. I stared at him without speaking. Outside the office window, traffic crawled slowly through downtown Phoenix while clouds darkened above. The skyline. Harold called it a character clause, Samuel said quietly. He believed wealth should reveal integrity, not replace it. I lowered my eyes toward the papers again. There it was in black ink beneath Harold's signature. Clear. Detailed. Legally airtight. Daniel does not know? I asked. Nobody knows except you and me. Samuel leaned back carefully in his chair. Harold insisted the clause remain confidential unless activation became necessary. Activation. Such a cold word for heartbreak. I swallowed slowly. And if they have already violated the conditions? Samuel's expression hardened for the first time since I arrived. Then legally speaking, Evelyn, Your son and daughter-in-law may already have lost everything. I looked down at Harold's signature again, while emotion rose quietly in my throat. Not grief this time. Something steadier. Harold had seen the storm coming long before I even noticed the clouds. And instead of warning me with fear, he had left me something far more valuable. Time. When I returned home from Samuel's office that afternoon, Heather was standing in the driveway speaking with a landscaping contractor beside a stack of stone samples spread across the hood of her white SUV. She looked almost cheerful beneath the Arizona sun, her blonde hair tied neatly behind her head, while she pointed toward the backyard patio Harold built himself 20 years earlier. We could extend the outdoor kitchen another 12 feet, she was saying as I stepped out of my car. The whole property needs a more modern flow. Modern flow. Harold once spent 3 weekends laying those patio stones by hand because he wanted family barbecues to feel welcoming. I remembered him sitting out there afterward with sore knees and dirt still under his fingernails, smiling proudly while Daniel grilled hamburgers beside the pool. Heather noticed me approaching and instantly shifted her expression into polite concern. "Evelyn, there you are," she called warmly. "How was lunch with your friend?" "Friend." I almost admired how naturally lies came to her now. "Very nice," I replied calmly. "Downtown traffic was terrible, though." She laughed lightly. "Phoenix is growing. Too fast." The contractor nodded politely at me before returning to his measurements. Neither of them asked whether I approved of strangers redesigning my property anymore. Inside the house, Daniel sat at the kitchen island reviewing spreadsheets on his laptop. "Hey, Mom," he said without looking up. "Heather found a really great retirement community outside Scottsdale today. You should look at the brochure later." I placed my purse gently on the counter and poured myself a glass of iced tea before answering. "Maybe I will." The silence that followed was almost amusing. Daniel finally looked up, clearly surprised by my lack of resistance. For months they had expected tears, hesitation, emotional conversations. Instead, they found calm agreement. And calm agreement makes greedy people careless. Over the next 2 weeks, I let them believe exactly what they wanted to believe. I nodded through discussions about renovations. I listened politely while Heather described open floor plans and property values. Once, I even pretended to consider moving dates while Olivia sat nearby scrolling through vacation rentals on her phone. Every conversation revealed more than they realized. "Once the house sells, we can finally get the lake property too," Heather whispered one evening while thinking I was asleep upstairs. Another night, Daniel casually discussed auctioning Harold's antique watch collection because nobody really uses that stuff anymore. Nobody really uses that stuff anymore. Funny how quickly history becomes inconvenience to people waiting for inheritance checks. Meanwhile, I followed every instruction Samuel gave me. Quietly, carefully, I updated financial protections, transferred charitable allocations, secured Harold's military records and business documents before Heather could move anything else into storage. Samuel handled everything discreetly through private meetings downtown. "Patience matters now," he reminded me during one call. "People reveal themselves completely once they think victory is guaranteed." He was right. Heather became almost radiant with confidence. She started referring to the house as our place in conversations with neighbors. Daniel even discussed converting my bedroom into a gym after I moved out. One afternoon, I passed the dining room and overheard Olivia asking softly, "Do you think Grandma is upset?" Heather answered before Daniel could speak. "Your grandmother is just having trouble accepting reality, sweetheart." Reality. I stood quietly in the hallway listening to the woman living under my roof explain my own life to my granddaughter. Then came the afternoon that confirmed everything Samuel warned me about. I returned early from the pharmacy and walked into the kitchen unnoticed while Daniel and Heather sat reviewing documents spread across the table. "Once she signs the final transfer papers, everything moves automatically," Heather said confidently. Daniel looked uneasy for only a moment before nodding slowly. "Good. I am tired of waiting." Waiting. Not grieving. Not healing. Waiting. I stepped backwards silently before either of them noticed me there. Then I walked upstairs, closed my bedroom door, and opened Harold's letter again beside the window while sunset spread orange light across the backyard he loved so much. Beneath his signature, one final handwritten sentence suddenly felt heavier than ever. "Trust them long enough, sweetheart, and they will tell you exactly who they are." The invitation for the family estate meeting arrived 3 days before Thanksgiving. Heather placed the envelope beside my breakfast plate with the careful satisfaction of someone delivering a long-awaited victory notice. Samuel wants everyone downtown Friday morning, she explained while stirring almond milk into her coffee. Probably just finalizing paperwork now that things are moving forward. Moving forward. I unfolded the cream-colored card slowly while sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows. Whitmore Estate Review. Friday, 10 o'clock. Bennett and Associates. Daniel seemed almost lighter that week. He smiled more often. Slept better. Once, I even heard him discussing vacation plans with Heather late at night, while they sat beside the backyard fire pit Harold installed for family gatherings years ago. Imagine spending Christmas in Aspen next year, Heather whispered excitedly. By then, everything will finally be settled. Settled. The strange thing about greed is how quickly it turns future money into present happiness. By Friday morning, the air in Phoenix carried that cool desert sharpness that only appears near winter. I dressed carefully in a navy wool suit Harold always loved because he said it made me look strong. Heather arrived downstairs wearing ivory slacks and pearl earrings, elegant enough for a country club luncheon. Daniel adjusted his cufflinks beside the front door while Olivia scrolled quietly through her phone in the foyer. Nobody seemed nervous except me, but my nervousness no longer came from fear. Samuel greeted us personally when we arrived at his office downtown. His expression remained perfectly professional, though I noticed the slight pause in his eyes when he looked at me. Thank you all for coming, he said evenly while leading us into the large conference room overlooking the city skyline. The long mahogany table reminded me painfully of the dining room at home. Family conversations always seem more dangerous around polished wood. Heather chose the chair closest to Samuel without hesitation. Daniel sat beside her, already loosening his tie with relaxed confidence. Olivia took the seat near the windows and barely looked up from her phone. I remained quiet while Samuel organized several folders neatly before him. As you know, he began calmly. Today we will review the updated distribution structure connected to the Whitmore Family Trust and estate holdings. Heather folded her hands together almost gracefully. Harold always wanted everything organized, she said softly. Samuel glanced at her briefly before continuing. The estate includes the primary residence, investment accounts, retirement assets, military benefits, antique collections, and several business-related holdings. Daniel nodded slowly while listening. I could almost see him mentally redesigning rooms inside the house already. Samuel spent nearly 20 minutes reviewing legal language and trust structures, while Heather occasionally exchanged subtle glances with Daniel. At one point, she even smiled faintly when the Scottsdale property investments were mentioned. Then Samuel opened the final folder. The room changed immediately. Even the air felt quieter somehow. There is one additional clause, he said carefully. Daniel leaned back comfortably in his chair. Of course there is, he joked lightly. Dad always loved complicated paperwork. Samuel did not smile. Instead, he removed a single document from the folder and adjusted his glasses slowly. Approximately 3 years ago, Harold Whitmore added a behavioral inheritance condition tied specifically to family conduct toward his wife following his death. Heather's smile disappeared almost invisibly. Samuel continued reading in the same calm voice. Any beneficiary found to have pressured, manipulated, emotionally isolated, financially coerced, or attempted to remove Evelyn Whitmore from her residence against her wishes shall immediately forfeit all inheritance rights under the Whitmore Family Trust. Nobody moved. Outside the conference room windows, traffic continued normally beneath the bright Arizona sky, while silence settled heavily across the table. Then Samuel looked directly at Daniel and Heather for the first time that morning. Based on documented evidence, witness testimony, financial records, recorded communications, and written statements collected over the past several months, the trust has determined both of you violated these conditions repeatedly. Heather's face lost color so quickly it frightened me. What? She whispered. Daniel stared at Samuel in complete disbelief. That is impossible. Samuel calmly slid several documents across the table toward them. Legally speaking, he said quietly, you forfeited your inheritance the moment you began trying to force Evelyn out of her home. For several seconds, nobody in the conference room spoke. Heather stared down at the documents in front of her as though the words might rearrange themselves into something more favorable if she looked long enough. Daniel blinked repeatedly, his face pale beneath the bright overhead lights. Even Olivia finally lowered her phone completely. Samuel remained calm while folding his hands neatly on the table. This determination was reviewed by independent counsel and confirmed under Arizona trust law. He explained evenly. The conditions were extremely specific. Daniel suddenly leaned forward in his chair. "This is ridiculous," he said sharply. "We never threatened my mother." Samuel nodded once. "No, you were more careful than that." He opened another folder and slid several printed pages across the table. However, repeated attempts to pressure her into assisted living placement, unauthorized property planning, emotional isolation, removal of personal belongings, and documented discussions regarding asset control all fall within the clause parameters established by Harold Whitmore. Heather's breathing became shallow beside him. "You recorded us?" she whispered. Samuel adjusted his glasses calmly. Security systems inside the residence remained active after Harold's passing. Your father-in-law anticipated potential disputes. Daniel looked at me then for the first time since the meeting began. Not like a son looking at his mother. Like a man realizing the game he believed he controlled had already ended weeks ago. "Mom," he said quietly, almost desperately now. "You knew about this?" I met his eyes steadily across the polished table. Not at first. The room fell silent again. Outside, sunlight reflected sharply against the glass buildings downtown, while traffic moved normally through the streets below. Strange how ordinary the world continues to look while entire families collapse inside conference rooms. Heather shook her head slowly. "This cannot be legal." Samuel's voice remained perfectly composed. "It is entirely legal." He turned another page inside the folder. As a result of the forfeiture clause, all direct inheritance allocations previously intended for Daniel Whitmore and Heather Whitmore have been revoked effective immediately. Olivia stared at her father in shock. "Wait," she said softly. "Then where does everything go?" Samuel finally looked toward me before answering. Under Evelyn Whitmore's updated instructions, the estate will now fund 3 permanent charitable trusts. Heather's chair shifted sharply against the floor. "What?" Samuel continued without emotion. "The Whitmore Veterans Housing Foundation, the Harold and Evelyn Scholarship Fund for Military Families, and the Desert Widow Support Initiative." Daniel looked physically ill now. "Dad left everything to strangers?" he whispered. "No," I answered quietly before Samuel could speak. "Your father left everything to people capable of gratitude." Heather suddenly pushed her chair backward and stood up. "This is insane," she snapped. "We took care of you. We moved into that house to help you." I watched her carefully for a moment. "No," I said softly. "You moved in because you thought waiting would eventually make the house yours." Her face tightened instantly. Daniel rubbed both hands across his forehead while staring at the documents spread before him. "Mom, please," he said finally. "We can fix this." Fix this. The same son who spent months discussing my removal like a scheduling inconvenience now sounded terrified of consequences. I should have felt satisfaction, maybe even anger. Instead, I mostly felt tired. Tired in the deep, quiet way people become after finally seeing something clearly they spent years trying not to notice. Samuel slid one final document across the table toward me. "There is one remaining personal allocation," he explained. I signed the paper calmly, while Daniel watched with growing confusion. "What is that?" he asked. I closed the folder gently before answering. "Your father wanted Olivia to have his Navy watch." Olivia looked stunned. "Me?" I nodded once. "Because out of everyone in this room, you are the only person who still looked ashamed." Nobody spoke after that. Heather stared silently out the conference room window. Daniel sat motionless beside her, hollow and defeated. And for the first time since Harold died, I realized something surprising. Losing money had not broken them. Discovering exactly who they had become was what finally did. We left Samuel's office just before noon. The elevator ride downstairs felt painfully quiet. Heather stood in the far corner with her arms folded tightly across her chest, while Daniel stared at the floor numbers above the doors, as though avoiding eye contact might somehow undo the last 2 hours. Olivia remained beside me silently, holding Harold's Navy watch box in both hands. The small blue velvet case looked almost fragile against her fingers. Outside, the November air carried a cool desert breeze through downtown Phoenix. Cars moved steadily through intersections. People crossed sidewalks holding coffee cups and shopping bags. Ordinary life continued around us while my family stood shattered on the curb beside a black marble office building. Daniel finally turned toward me once we reached the parking lot. "Mom," he said quietly. His voice sounded smaller now, younger somehow. For one brief second, I saw the little boy who used to wait by the front window every evening for Harold to come home from work. "Please do not do this." I looked at him carefully. "It is already done." Heather stepped forward immediately. "You manipulated this entire situation," she snapped. "You sat there pretending to be helpless while setting us up." I almost smiled at the irony of hearing manipulation discussed so passionately by the woman who spent months trying to organize my removal from my own home. "No," I answered calmly. "I simply stopped interrupting people while they revealed themselves." Her face hardened instantly. Daniel rubbed both hands over his mouth before speaking again. "We were trying to help you." I nodded slowly. "That is what you kept telling yourselves." Nobody argued after that. There are moments when the truth enters a room so completely that even angry people recognize resistance is useless. Olivia finally looked toward her father. "Dad?" she whispered softly. "Grandma heard everything, did she not?" Daniel closed his eyes briefly but never answered. That silence told her enough. I walked to my car slowly while sunlight reflected across the windshield. Harold always hated downtown parking garages because he said they smelled like hot concrete and stress. Strange the things grief remembers. Just before opening the driver's door, I turned back toward them one final time. Heather stood rigid beside the sidewalk staring at me with a mixture of disbelief and humiliation. Daniel looked exhausted, older than his 50 years. Olivia remained caught somewhere painfully between them all. "The house stays exactly as your grandfather built it," I told her gently. "No renovations, no contractors, no modern flow." For the first time all morning, Olivia smiled faintly through tears. "He would like that?" she whispered. I nodded once. "Yes, he would." That evening, I returned home alone. The house felt different the moment I stepped inside. Not larger, not emptier. Quieter in a peaceful way I had not felt since Harold died. I walked slowly through every room while sunset painted long amber shadows across the hardwood floors. Harold's photograph sat back in the hallway where it belonged. His study door stood open again after Samuel arranged for the locks to be removed earlier that afternoon. I stepped inside carefully. Dust floated softly through the golden light near the windows. His reading glasses still rested beside the lamp exactly where he left them months ago. I lowered myself into the leather chair behind his desk and looked around the room we built together through decades of ordinary life. Marriage is not really made from grand moments. It is made from small loyalties repeated quietly over time. Cups of coffee, shared bills, holding hands during hospital visits, defending each other even when nobody is watching. Harold understood that. In the end, he did not leave behind money to protect me. He left behind truth. And truth has a strange way of surviving long after love, inheritance, and pride collapse around it. Outside the study window, the desert sky slowly darkened over Phoenix while the grandfather clock downstairs began chiming the hour. For the first time in many months, I no longer felt like a guest in my own life. I was finally home.